One of the reasons why this conference was placed at this time is because on Thursday there is the Global Partnership for Education. Many words. Global Campaign for Education, Global Partnership for Education. But the Global Partnership for Education is a multilateral fund where many of the donor countries pledge what they will fund, how much they will fund for education. Ministers from countries that will receive will be present. It is the biggest multilateral fund that exists to education. So financing-wise, day. And I think the whole post-2015 agenda, trying to get new goals, hopefully merging, as it looks like, the MDGs and the SDGs, is on the agenda again and will be for UNESCO and UNICEF as well. So this ask you to come to the stage, please. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you for coming up here and joining us. We look very much forward to hear your presentation, and by the end of the session, we hope to have questions. We hope if you want to tweet some of your questions, so you're very welcome. We hope that we can interact. We've asked the panelists to only talk for about 10 minutes, and I'd ask you very kindly to keep as much as you can to the 10 minutes. But before we go on, I think one of the questions Morten said was,
Thank you, Hela. And just to say that I think I'm not a very good citizen because I did the global thing and I crossed the planet to be here. Just arrived this morning after 24 hours of traveling. So it's lovely to be here, and I want to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to just provide a little bit of a historical perspective to this concept of global citizenship education, which I think for me, just like for you, is probably a newish concept. We have many of these concepts in education, which I'll talk about a bit today. The one I've worked with the most over the last 10 years is ESD, which is Education for Sustainable Development. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So there's different ways to approach a brief like this, and of course all of them are historical, and history, as we know, is multi-layered, and it also has many sides. So I want to start just with a very short, what I would say, an official institutional history of, I won't say GCE,
Oh, yeah.
but the notion of global citizenship education as we see it in, if I could call it, in the United Nations headlines today, and it really seems to have, got to the real top end of the headlines in the UN Global Education First initiative that was announced in 2012 by the UN Secretary General. Of course, it would have been discussed in other ways before that, but I'm talking now about the big headlines. So this is an interesting concept. It's only 2 years old if you look at it from that historical perspective. And it integrates a number of important concepts such as interdependence, sustainable development, climate change, common humanity. And then, of course, what it also does very importantly is it relates these concepts to issues of access and to quality in education, because it's one of 3 major goals in the UN Global Education First initiative. So that's one little piece of history. I want to, though, go a little bit further and go into what I would call a slightly wider and longer term historical journey. And here, I think if we really want to trace the origins of this concept that we're working with as we meet here together, it's really important for us to begin to probe the array of issues to which this concept is responding. And these issues are both social, they're political, they're cultural, they're global, and they're environmental in nature. And these issues have got a very long history. And they also have a very long string of what I would call institutional responses. And we can trace these institutional responses back to the establishment of the UN itself in 1945 after the Second World War, where 50 states gathered together to pay collective attention to these issues, issues such as world peace, freedom, social justice, and human rights. We haven't stopped talking about them since then, and they were talked about before then too. So over time, we've had expanding institutional commitments to these issues, to human rights, to democracy, sustainable development, non-violence, and so on. And what we've also seen over time is a whole lot of different forms of education that have emerged. Peace education, development education, environmental education. That's when I was growing up. 1992, I started with environmental education. Then after that, we had education for sustainable development. At the same time, we've had global education, we've had citizenship education, and all of these, interestingly enough, appear to flourish in tandem. So they flourish at the same time, and they create this kind of very interesting movement in the education system, and they also flourish in parallel with each other. And then sometimes we have groups that come together and we have these bigger discussions about what it is that we're trying to do. So this list of these kinds of education is long. It's diverse, and the purpose, interestingly, is quite similar amongst all of these forms of education. And the purpose is really to try to orientate people to how to live ethically and how to live peacefully with each other, with others around the world, and with the environment on which they depend. So these forms of education, we can trace them also into all of these major international political gatherings. We've seen at times some of the largest gatherings of state leaders to come together to discuss these kinds of issues. So for example, early on we had the International Peace Conference in The Hague. That was in 1899, long time ago. We had the 1945 San Francisco emergence of the UN Charter, very, very significant global document, which we still all trying to work with. And so on, and we've seen big education conferences like Yom-Team. We've seen big gender conferences like the Beijing Conference on Women in 1995 is the one that stands out for me in my mind, probably also because I was sort of growing up then. And then, of course, in the first year that I started environmental education, we had the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, massively exciting international event, very important international event. It's been followed in 2002, which I think was when we were working with Hella, in Johannesburg with the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And most recently, we've had the Rio +20, which is starting to shape the SDGs that were mentioned earlier. So, and what's been interesting is that each of these gatherings, in their own way, have emphasized the importance of mobilizing education as a force for global social change. And education has, through these events, been charged with things like to support peace, human rights, equity, acceptance of diversity, and sustainable development. So we're putting these items onto the educational agenda. And we've had also a number of decades, the most recent one being the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. It will come to an end now in 2050, perhaps ironically, just as the world is producing sustainable development goals. But it's very good and interesting to see that education is a strong focus within those SDGs, and even within the education goal, you can find ESD. And there's a global action plan for ESD, so that we don't just stop at the end of the decade. And this is like emerging and going on while we are also discussing the emergence of global citizenship education. So these things are interesting, and I think we have to understand, what's going on here, really. And so I think one needs to take another historical journey, and I think we have to go back to the antecedents of the social movements, the rise of social movements in society. And we can see different generations of these. We have the earlier social movements that emerged in industrial society, which brought about 3 generations of human rights. We've had the civil and political rights, we've had economic, social, and cultural rights, and most recently we've had collective rights, which are focusing on development, clean and healthy environment, and so on. Then, of course, we've had the anti-slavery, the anti-colonial movements, feminist movements. We've had a lot of these social movements, and one has to ask yourself, what is going on when we have so many of these social movements, and what are they all trying to do? Okay, they're all trying to look for a better life for all, justice, peace, equity, sustainability. These words, we know them. They're there all the time, and I think it's good to look back into the social movements, because then we can see why it is that these kinds of educations are there in the first place. And when we look across all of these forms of education, we can see that they're all trying to do some of the things. They have and I think it's important to understand the core of these education movements. So there's a broader understanding of the world we live, its problems, its solutions, how we can do things differently. There's another very key thing that's common across them all. They're trying